Just 1 week after Washington and Tehran signed a deal both sides called the end of the war, a single Iranian drone slammed into a cargo ship in the Strait of Hormuz. And what followed wasn't a minor diplomatic scuffle. It was 5 straight days of American strikes, more than 300 targets hit, sanctions reimposed, and an Iranian military command publicly promising what they called a crushing response. A response that landed not in the Gulf, but on a U.S. airbase in Jordan. This is the story of how a ceasefire that was supposed to be holding completely fell apart in less than a month, and why the Pentagon is now dealing with an Iran that refuses to simply back down. Let's rewind to understand exactly how fragile this entire situation actually was before it collapsed. Because the story of this specific escalation really starts with a deal that looked, on paper, like genuine progress. According to detailed reporting from NPR, the United States and Iran had signed a preliminary agreement aimed at ending the broader war that had been raging since February, when American and Israeli strikes killed Iran's supreme leader and dozens of senior officials in a single devastating opening blow. As part of that deal, the Trump administration agreed to lift sanctions on Iranian oil sales for 60 days, a genuinely significant economic concession meant to give Iran real breathing room and real incentive to hold to the ceasefire. It lasted less than a week. According to that same NPR reporting, on June 25th, just 7 days after the agreement was signed, an Iranian drone slammed directly into a cargo ship sailing through the Strait of Hormuz. There were no casualties and no major damage from that specific strike, but according to NPR's own assessment, that single attack set off a chain of hostilities that would put the two countries right back on a path toward all-out war, less than a month after they had formally agreed to stop fighting in the first place. Each strike and each counterstrike that followed chipped away at the foundation of that fragile agreement, piece by piece, until, according to NPR's reporting, the deal had essentially collapsed entirely, even as diplomatic efforts continued trying, with limited success, to salvage what was left of it. Let's walk through exactly how this escalation actually unfolded, because the pace of it is genuinely staggering when you lay it out day by day. According to CNN's live coverage from July 7th, the United States reimposed sanctions on Iranian oil that same day, directly reversing the sanctions relief that had been part of the original ceasefire agreement just weeks earlier. American officials were explicit about why. According to that reporting, the decision came specifically in retaliation for a continuing series of Iranian attacks on commercial ships near the strait. Alongside reimposing those sanctions, U.S. Central Command confirmed it had hit more than 80 separate targets across Iran that same day. Iran's response wasn't quiet diplomatic protest. According to CNN's reporting, Iran's top joint military command, known as Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, released a statement carried by Iran's own state broadcaster declaring, in their exact words, that the armed forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran will deliver a crushing response to the U.S. aggression and terrorist action. That same statement went further, declaring that Iran would, under no circumstances, allow interference in the affairs or management of the Strait of Hormuz, and insisting that the only safe passage for vessels traveling through the strait was through routes that Iran itself had designated. Think about what that actually represents. This isn't a country quietly absorbing American strikes and looking for a way to de-escalate. This is Iran's own military command, publicly, on state television, promising direct retaliation and reasserting total control over one of the most critical waterways on the entire planet, despite having just agreed, only weeks earlier, to a ceasefire specifically designed to keep that exact waterway open and stable. And Iran didn't just talk about that crushing response. They delivered it, though not necessarily in the location most people were watching most closely. According to CNN's coverage, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched what they called retaliatory strikes against Prince Hassan Air Base in Jordan, a facility hosting American forces, roughly 117 kilometers northwest of the Jordanian capital, Amman. Let that sink in for a moment. This entire cycle of escalation began over attacks on commercial shipping inside the Strait of Hormuz, a body of water sitting between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. And within days, Iran's response had expanded to striking an American-linked military installation in Jordan, a country that sits nowhere near the strait itself, geographically distant from the original flashpoint entirely. That kind of geographic expansion tells you something important about how this conflict was evolving in real time. It wasn't staying contained to the specific waterway where the initial provocation happened. It was spreading outward, pulling in additional countries and additional American military assets scattered across the broader region. Let's fast forward just a few days further, because the escalation didn't slow down. According to CNN's live reporting from July 11th, the United States launched yet another round of strikes, this time specifically triggered by an attack on a Cyprus-flagged container ship transiting the Strait of Hormuz. According to Central Command's own statement posted directly to social media, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces had, in the military's own words, blatantly attacked that container ship, and one crew member from the vessel was reported missing following the assault. Central Command's statement didn't hold back in describing just how significant this specific American response actually was. According to that statement, this represented the third round of U.S. strikes that same week alone. And across those 3 consecutive nights of strikes, Central Command confirmed it had hit more than 300 separate targets, all specifically aimed at degrading Iran's ability to attack civilian mariners and commercial vessels freely transiting the strait. 300 targets in 3 nights. That's an extraordinary tempo of military operations, far beyond what most people would typically associate with a country that had, just weeks earlier, signed a formal agreement supposedly ending this exact conflict. According to Central Command's own language, quoted directly in CNN's reporting, Iran had been given yet another opportunity to demonstrate adherence to the Memorandum of Understanding after already being held accountable for earlier attacks on commercial vessels, but had, in the military's own assessment, again failed to comply. That phrase, again failed, tells you this wasn't the first time Iran had been warned and given a chance to step back from this pattern of attacks. It was becoming a repeated, almost routine cycle. Warning, violation, strike, and then, predictably, another violation shortly after. Let's talk about what happened just a few days after that, because the escalation kept climbing rather than leveling off. According to CNN's coverage from July 15th, the United States completed a second wave of strikes on Iran that day, marking what CNN specifically described as the 5th straight day of American attacks. According to that same report, President Trump was actively weighing options to further expand the broader military operation, according to sources who spoke directly with CNN, suggesting that even after 5 consecutive days of strikes and hundreds of targets already hit, the American response hadn't necessarily reached its ceiling yet. That same day brought a detail that reveals just how directly this conflict was now touching Iran's own capital city, not just remote military and naval targets scattered along the coastline. According to CNN's reporting, air defenses were activated early Thursday morning local time in parts of Tehran itself, with Iranian state media confirming the activation, and a resident in the capital telling CNN directly that they had been awoken by a loud explosion. Whatever precisely triggered that explosion, the fact that ordinary residents in Iran's own capital were being woken up by loud blasts and activated air defenses tells you this conflict had moved well beyond isolated naval skirmishes far offshore. It was reaching directly into the heart of Iran's largest city. That same CNN report also revealed exactly which specific American strikes had happened earlier that same day, and the target itself tells you something genuinely important about American strategy at this point in the conflict. According to that reporting, U.S. forces had launched a 90-minute round of attacks specifically targeting Greater Tunbih Island, a location CNN had previously reported on back in March as one of what a researcher specifically described as part of Iran's, quote, arch defense. Later that same day, according to that same report, U.S. forces launched an additional round of strikes at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, this time specifically focused on what Central Command described as Iranian military capabilities used to threaten vessels freely transiting through the Strait of Hormuz, though the exact location of those specific later strikes wasn't publicly specified. Let's talk about the economic backdrop informing all of this, because understanding just how costly this entire extended standoff had already become helps explain why both sides kept escalating rather than simply walking away. According to Wikipedia's detailed documentation of the broader naval blockade that the United States had imposed on Iran earlier in the conflict, that blockade alone, which ran from April 13th through late May before being lifted as part of the original ceasefire agreement, had reportedly cost Iran roughly $500 million every single day, according to American estimates. During that same blockade period, according to CNN's July 15th reporting, Central Command claimed to have redirected 142 ships and disabled 9 additional vessels that didn't comply with the blockade over that roughly 2-month stretch. That gives you a real sense of just how enormous and how costly this entire standoff over the strait had already become, even before this latest round of escalation in July pushed things even further. Now, amid all of this military escalation, there was actually one small, genuinely notable moment of apparent goodwill that stands out precisely because it's so different in tone from everything else happening during the same window. According to CNN's July 15th reporting, President Trump shared on social media that Iran had released an American woman who had been detained since December of 2024, and Trump specifically praised what he called Tehran's gesture of goodwill in making that release happen. That's a genuinely strange, almost jarring detail to sit alongside everything else happening during this exact same period. American strikes hitting hundreds of targets, Iran's military promising crushing retaliation, air defenses activating over Tehran itself. And yet, in the middle of all of that open hostility, a diplomatic gesture involving a detained American citizen's release was still quietly happening. A reminder that even amid escalating military conflict, certain narrow diplomatic channels sometimes continue operating in parallel, almost entirely separate from the broader, much more dangerous military confrontation unfolding at the exact same time. Let's also address directly what Iran's own foreign ministry was saying publicly throughout this entire period, because their stated position adds an important additional layer to understanding just how far apart both sides actually were during this specific window. According to that same CNN reporting from July 15th, an Iranian foreign ministry spokesperson stated plainly that Iran had no plans for negotiations with the United States at that point. That's a genuinely significant, hardline diplomatic position for Iran's government to take publicly, especially considering that just weeks earlier, both countries had been sitting across from each other, finalizing what was supposed to be a durable ceasefire agreement. Going from active negotiation and a signed memorandum of understanding to a flat public statement that no further negotiations were currently planned in the span of less than a month tells you just how completely this entire diplomatic process had broken down under the weight of repeated strikes and counterstrikes. Let's zoom out now and talk about why this specific pattern of escalation genuinely stunned many people watching closely, including, according to multiple reports, officials within the Pentagon itself, who had reportedly expected the ceasefire to hold with considerably more stability than it ultimately did. According to NPR's broader analysis of this entire situation, the fundamental problem wasn't really about any single attack or any single retaliatory strike. It was about the structural fragility of the underlying agreement itself. Each individual strike and counterstrike, as NPR put it, chipped away at the pillars of the agreement, meaning the ceasefire was never actually resolving the deeper underlying tensions driving this conflict in the first place. It was essentially papering over them temporarily, and once the first violation happened, the entire structure proved considerably less stable than either side's public statements had originally suggested. There's a genuinely important strategic lesson buried in this specific pattern of escalation too, one that extends well beyond just this particular conflict. When a ceasefire agreement includes significant tangible economic incentives, in this specific case, 60 days of lifted oil sanctions, there's an implicit assumption that both sides have a strong practical financial motivation to actually maintain the agreement and avoid jeopardizing those benefits. But what actually happened here suggests that whatever internal pressures or strategic calculations were driving Iran's continued attacks on shipping through the strait, they ultimately outweighed the very real economic cost of having sanctions reimposed. That's a genuinely significant data point for understanding the underlying dynamics at play, suggesting that whoever within Iran's government or military apparatus was authorizing these continued attacks on commercial vessels viewed whatever they were trying to accomplish, whether that's continued deterrence, continued control over the strait, or internal political pressure to appear strong rather than accommodating, as more important than preserving the tangible economic benefits the ceasefire agreement had specifically provided. Let's also talk about what this specific pattern reveals about the broader command and control dynamics inside Iran during this period, because it connects directly to everything we've covered about the internal instability and fractured leadership Iran has been dealing with since losing so many senior officials back in February. If Iran's own civilian negotiators and diplomatic officials had genuinely intended for this ceasefire to hold, but elements within Iran's military or Revolutionary Guard apparatus continued launching attacks on shipping. Despite that broader diplomatic intention, that would suggest exactly the kind of fractured, uncoordinated command structure that other reporting throughout this entire conflict has repeatedly pointed toward, a government where civilian officials, military commanders, and hardline factions within the security establishment don't necessarily share the same priorities or answer to the same clear, unified chain of command. So let's bring this all back to the central question sitting at the heart of this entire story. Why did Iran's response to this renewed round of American strikes genuinely stun the Pentagon? Based on everything documented across multiple independent sources, it wasn't really about the sheer fact that Iran retaliated at all. Almost everyone expected some form of Iranian response to continued American strikes. What appears to have been genuinely unexpected was the combination of just how quickly the entire carefully negotiated ceasefire completely collapsed, breaking down within a single week of being signed, and just how far Iran was ultimately willing to expand this conflict geographically, striking an American base in Jordan, continuing attacks on commercial shipping despite reimposed sanctions, and hundreds of American strikes in direct response, and publicly, unambiguously rejecting any further negotiations, even as the human and economic costs on Iran's own side continued climbing rapidly with every passing day. So where does this leave things right now, as of the most recent information available? The ceasefire that briefly held in mid-June has, according to NPR's own direct assessment, effectively collapsed, even as diplomatic efforts continue trying, with genuinely uncertain success, to salvage some version of it. American strikes against Iranian targets have continued at an extraordinary pace, with hundreds of targets hit across multiple consecutive days throughout early and mid-July alone. Iran's own military leadership continues publicly promising further retaliation rather than signaling any genuine willingness to step back from this cycle. And Iran's foreign ministry has explicitly stated there are currently no plans for renewed negotiations, leaving both countries in a genuinely dangerous, unresolved position, one where the underlying tensions that originally sparked this entire war back in February remain every bit as unresolved now as they were before that brief, ultimately fragile ceasefire was ever signed in the first place. If this story raised as many questions for you as it did for me while putting it together, drop a comment below and let me know what you think happens next in this rapidly escalating standoff. Do you believe there's still a realistic path back to some kind of lasting ceasefire? Or do you think this conflict is now genuinely locked into the kind of sustained, back and forth military confrontation that becomes increasingly difficult for either side to walk back from? I read every single comment, and I want to hear your honest take on this one. And if you found this breakdown valuable, share it with someone who needs to understand just how quickly this supposedly resolved conflict has spiraled back into open warfare. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next update the moment new developments come out of this region. Because based on everything we just covered, this story is very much still unfolding in real time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.